When I was in high school back in 1999, skipping maths class and trying to stick my hand up the skirt of any girl that had let me, I think I was perfectly justified in also being distracted from schoolwork with games like Half-Life on the PC. Not to mention Unreal, Sin, and Quake 2. Yeah, I said Quake 2. At the time, Half-Life was just so damn huge, and I think I've mentioned in other videos before how it was the first time that my friends who weren't into gaming started asking me about it. Mates who I'd barely even seen pick up a controller or sit down in front of a flickering CRT monitor were now asking me about a video game. That's the effect that it had on people. We all know what happened with the series. There were a couple of expansion packs with Opposing Force and Blue Shift. Oddly enough though, it only got ported to the PlayStation 2, with the GameCube and Xbox being ignored.
They're waiting for you, Gordon, in the test chamber.
Now, I think it's generally agreed that out of the three consoles at the time, the PS2 was technically the weakest, and I know that with a lot of the multi-platform titles, the PlayStation 2 version was usually the worst one off. That's definitely the case for Resident Evil 4 with the PS2 and GameCube, and also Max Payne with the PS2 and the Xbox. The Half-Life port though, despite running on the inferior hardware, still managed to be pretty damn good, and to this day is still highly playable. This version was developed by none other than Gearbox Software, and at one point you can even see old mate Randy Pitchford's name in the credits. A Dreamcast version was also in the works, but never properly released, making this PS2 version even more unique. Most people should be pretty familiar with the game's story. It's a first-person shooter where everyone's favourite MIT graduate, Gordon Freeman, opens up some kind of portal to another dimension, which eventually has the rippling effect of leading an alien race to Earth who go on to enslave all of humanity in the sequel. Yeah, nice work, Gordon. This port doesn't do a thing to touch the core of what makes Half-Life what it is. This is the same Black Mesa Research Facility we all know and love. Well, most of us anyway. So it does do by and large just a really good job of carrying the game across to the console. Running on a console, this port has had to make a few differences to the level design, but it's never something that's come at the expense of removing entire sections, instead of what happened with the Xbox port for Doom 3. It's really just minor things, like at the start of Office Complex, this area has slightly changed. You'll notice a few different looking rooms during Honor Rail, and surface tension has less enemies as well. Also, much more of an egregious fault, the armory in this chapter is way smaller. A really good one though, and what I think is even an objective improvement, is that at the end of Blast Pit, when you fall through that huge pipe and land on a table, now that room is full of water. In vanilla Half-Life, it'd be possible to not have enough health points to survive that fall, meaning the only way to get past it was to cheat. Putting in the water removes that, because whenever you land in water in Half-Life, regardless of the height that you fall from, it absorbs all fall damage. You could fall off a cliff into a puddle that's as deep as your ankles and you'd still survive. There's a neat little quality of life addition now, with interactive objects having a little bracket around them to make it easier to spot. The double jump module now activates by pressing jump twice, which makes way more sense than pressing crouch and jump. Oh, and speaking of crouch jump, you can turn this on automatically in the options menu to save you having to do it manually. Now you can just hold down the jump button and Gordon goes right into crouching. Just like on the PC, the quick save, which you're going to be using a lot, is also fast and handy. You go into the menu, you press quick save, and then the start button to confirm. It takes all of 3 seconds. You're gonna have to use this too, because oddly there's no checkpoints. Normally in Half-Life you'd get a checkpoint every time a new map loaded, but here you get nothing. It goes off your manual quick save only. I mean, what is it with these console ports and always fucking up one aspect of the saving procedure? All you need is manual saves and checkpoints. Why is this so hard? The main thing I have an issue with on this port though is how you select weapons. Now, anyone familiar with Half-Life knows that its weapons are broken up into categories, so you've got the pistol and the magnum in the same category, the submachine gun, shotgun and the crossbow in another, and so forth. To select the next weapon category, you press left or right on the D-pad. To just select the next weapon though, you either press up or down. Make sense? What doesn't help either is that there's no button for last equipped weapon anymore, or even any way of trying to incorporate that mechanic. On the PC, I think that it was bound to Q by default, and if you pressed it, you could swap out to the last weapon you'd used. This was a really handy mechanic before combat. You could have maybe like a shotgun and a magnum on quick swap. Fire off a few shots with the shotgun, then quickly swap to the magnum to finish someone off. Or, I don't know, maybe the magnum and the crossbow. It just made the combat a lot more enjoyable than using one weapon over and over. And despite most players probably overlooking this mechanic entirely, it was a huge part of the shooting in the vanilla game. I mean, watch anyone play Half-Life who knows what they're doing, and you'll see them swapping back and forth between a couple of weapons really quickly and often. When you take that button out, it's just a much more standard first-person shooter and not a very exciting one. I've always said that the core shooting mechanics in Half-Life games aren't all that good, and this is certainly proving my point. The other thing that really chafes my willy is the lock-on system. Now, a lot of console shooters use a pretty liberal lock-on system or an auto-targeting system with the controls, where you've only really got to kind of aim around the vicinity of an enemy and then the auto-aim does the rest. Half-Life still does this, but aside from it targeting an enemy, you've still got to then press the circle button to lock on, at which point your crosshair is snapped to that particular target and you're free to move around at will. And I just don't like this because it at times seems very temperamental. Sometimes it locks onto someone you're not even really aiming near, and then other times your crosshair's 2 pixels to the left or the right of something and it won't lock on. And yeah, good luck getting it to lock onto Headcrabs. It's a complete asshole when it comes to that, making those things even more fucking annoying if such a thing was even possible. Headcrabs and manhacks, 2 of the most annoying enemies in FPS games, and both of them from the Half-Life series. Platforming sections, like I said before, they aren't that great either. Residue processing and some of the areas in Office Complex can just suck this wang. And this bit here, which has to be one of the worst platforming sections like ever. I mean, imagine being the person responsible for designing this. Are you shitting me? You could actually plug a mouse and a keyboard into the console and play it that way, but I mean, at that point, why not just play it on the PC anyway? More of a subjective issue I have with this game is the way that it uses the so-called high-definition models. The original high-definition pack for Half-Life was released around the same time as the Blue Shift expansion pack, and it updates all of the weapon and the character models to much more detailed versions. Now, this is not the exact same as the HD pack on the PC, though it's more like its own console-friendly version. But I think where it looks the worst is with some of the NPCs. The Barney's security guards, for instance, just look weird. Their helmet looks like a goddamn bell end. For most of the weapons, it looks okay. Like, I like how the crowbar's got a bit more detail, but they've changed some of the weapons out entirely. Originally, the pistol was based off a Glock. Now in the HD pack, it's based off a Beretta. The submachine gun was originally an MP5, but now it's an M4. I know the Half-Life series has never had the most realistic guns in a shooting game, and I understand how stupid it was how an MP5 had a grenade launcher that you could fire without even having to press a trigger. But I mean, those guns were synonymous with Half-Life. The box art for Opposing Force, for instance, shows Adrian Shepard holding an MP5, not an M4. It just kind of goes against the grain of what Half-Life is always about. At least on the PC version you could turn this stuff off, but here you're kinda stuck with it. Along with Barney's new deformed head. I mean, look at him. He looks like he's about to tell Gordon that he just pooed his pants. Other than that though, I still think that this is a pretty damn solid port. It's even got a cheat mode where you can play as a Vortigern, running around and swiping at things and shooting lightning bolts. I mean, it's definitely unique. They've even changed it so NPCs all sound like they're speaking gibberish to reflect how the Vortigaunts can't understand our language. The only downside to this PlayStation 2 version is that it doesn't include Opposing Force or Blue Shift. I mean, even if Blue Shift is about as long as a fart hangs around in a phone booth, it's still worth checking out. What it does include though is Decay, the co-op campaign, which is just awesome and never gets talked about enough. This is a short co-op campaign where you're playing as the 2 other people to wear a HEV suit at Black Mesa, Gina Cross and Colette Green. You remember those 2 empty HEV suit spots at the beginning of Half-Life? Yeah, those were their suits. Gina might also seem familiar because she's the hologram lady who puts you through your paces in the training course.
If you see one of these buttons, press it, and I will appear to demonstrate certain moves.
And she's also the first hologram lady to give me a semi. Now this thing was originally supposed to make it to the PC, but for some reason it only ever got held back on the console, which like I said makes the PlayStation 2 port a pretty unique version of the game, and honestly worth the price of admission alone, considering as far as I know this is all considered canon. Not to mention, along with Adrian Shepard, Gina and Colette are two characters whose fates Valve have never even acknowledged ever since. This campaign takes place around the time of the Resonance Cascade. In fact, you're pretty much responsible for it, sending that sample up to Gordon that he pushes into the machine to create the portal to Zen. You also work closely with Dr. Rosenberg, who plays a pretty big role in Blue Shift, and also Dr. Keller, some poor asshole who's stuck in a wheelchair.
Dr. Freeman is running late. Again. Honestly, I do not understand what Kleiner sees in that boy.
These two also cause some pretty serious mishaps too. They're the ones responsible for calling in the military. The military who'd go on to wipe out most of the other Black Mesa survivors. Though they are also responsible for closing the portal, so you can't really hate on that. Levels are pretty unique as well, even if they are a bit short. One mission you're even moving through the hazard training course, which is now in complete disarray. Puzzles often require both players to work together, like you might have to turn some kind of valve, while your buddy covers you from spawning enemies. And sticking together is essential as the enemy count is a lot higher. One bit you've got to hold out against these waves of controllers that spawn in, and it doesn't help that ammo and health has to be shared across each player. I think the split screen thing is also kind of confusing, and I found it really distracting. You don't see your weapon model either, which is sometimes confusing during combat. But I still do think that this is a super fun campaign, and like a lot of things like drugs and masturbation, it's way more fun with a friend. Someone even made it playable on the PC when it got turned into its own standalone mod, but I never managed to get this thing working, and I heard it's also really buggy, but best of luck. All in all, I've got to say, this is a great console port. I mean, it's not going to turn you into a Half-Life fanboy if you're one of those contrarians who likes to hate on it. But for those who are familiar with the PC version, there's a lot of novelty to be had trying it out again on the PlayStation 2, just make sure you bring a friend. It's kind of funny then how much positive stuff I have to say about this port when you consider that the next time a Half-Life game would be ported to a console was with the abysmal port of Half-Life 2 to the Xbox in 2005. Now, whereas the PlayStation port of Half-Life is kind of unique and worth checking out for its original content, this Xbox port of Half-Life 2 is not. And I'd even argue it's the worst possible way to play the game. Unless there's some kind of worse off port as well that I don't know about, like maybe someone got it working on like a BlackBerry phone or something. I know there was an odd version of Half-Life 2 released in Japanese arcades, but I'd wager that that's still better than this is. Playing this port, I'm reminded of that Jeff Goldblum line from Jurassic Park, where he said that they were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
And the reason for that is because this port is just kind of embarrassing.
Dr. Freeman, I presume.
The frame rate is about as reliable as a doll bludger is with a Centrelink payout.
I expected more warning.
On the surface, it is definitely impressive that it's running on the hardware, but the texture quality looks horrible. It's impossible to even really make out what things are supposed to be at times, and some surfaces just look like smeared shit. In some instances, they've replaced like chain fences with concrete walls to decrease the view distance in an attempt to improve performance, I guess. But that's kind of like putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. There's a heap of pop-in as well, which sure isn't helping, but the controls are also to blame as well. I actually fell to my death during that bit at the start where you're running across the rooftop. That's how choppy and bad the game controls. Now look, I probably finished Half-Life 2 a couple of dozen times on the PC, and I've never once fallen off that rooftop. Explosions will often cause the frame rate to drop into single digits, and I had to take a break at one point when I got to Water Hazard because it became so choppy that it started to make me feel sick. Also, some genius thought it would be a good idea to bind both the acceleration and turning left and right with the airboat solely to the left stick, which is not a good idea because trying to drive straight becomes super tricky. Yeah, good luck getting the airboat up some of those more narrow ramps without smacking into the side like an idiot. And if that ain't enough, there's this weird kind of aim acceleration when turning with the right thumbstick, making it far too easy to over-aim when turning quickly. I don't know which bright spark came up with the idea of aiming acceleration. It's up there as one of the absolute banes of video game features, along with motion blur and inverted aiming controls. Honestly, if this was the way that you first played Half-Life 2, then I don't know what else to tell you, aside from saying that your parents probably didn't love you.
Right you are.
Don't worry though, because I do.
Yeah, you and me both, Doc.
I'd actually planned to do a separate video on this thing entirely, but within 5 minutes of playing it, I knew that I just couldn't be able to stomach the whole thing. Literally. Like I said, it makes me sick. Makes me sick! About the only thing it does right is the save system. It uses checkpoints and a quick save system. Finally. I also like how weapon selection works. Weapons are now broken down into categories on the D-pad, either up, down, left or right, and I just found this a whole lot more easier to use than the first game. Otherwise, it's really just an inferior version of Half-Life 2. It's a downgrade in almost every single aspect. It's kind of like playing Doom on the Super Nintendo. It's impressive technically, but when the whole thing is in motion, it's like watching something struggle by on life support.
Right you are.
I even had a friend who owned this back in the day and he said that it would cause his Xbox to freeze constantly. I'd even heard a rumor that it could brick your console entirely. I mean, look, I like Half-Life 2, but not enough for it to permanently disable my console. The best possible way to play Half-Life 2 on the console is still the orange box, which is the closest version you're going to get to the PC version. Why Valve still haven't ported this to the Xbox One or the PlayStation 4 is just beyond me. Maybe these guys just hate money. Love it or hate it though, Half-Life on the PlayStation 2 is a technical marvel. And despite having to make a few shortcuts here and there, it makes a fun return to the Black Mesa facility, and I think a justified one. Half-Life might have aged over the years, but the brilliance of this port still shines through. Now, all we really need is a PlayStation 2 port for Hunt Down the Freeman, then the cycle will be complete.